Franklin Reed wasn't supposed to touch the chalk, just clean it. But when a Stanford professor walked in and saw the janitor writing an equation he couldn't solve, he humiliated him in front of a full classroom. What no one knew? That same equation would one day break the internet and expose a lie buried for 30 years. But by the time the truth came out, it was almost too late. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The corridors of Stanford University's Department of Theoretical Physics had a quiet arrogance about them. Even at night, when the lights were dimmed and lecture halls silent, the place carried itself with the pride of being home to the world's greatest minds. The floors were marble polished, the chalkboards enormous, and the doors heavy with importance. The smell was part chemical cleaner, part intellectual exhaustion. At 11:43 p.m., no professors walked these halls. No students argued about theories or scribbled formulas on whiteboards. The only sounds were the soft hum of overhead lights and the distant, rhythmic squeak of a mop being pushed down the hallway. Franklin Reed knew this building better than most. He knew which door hinges squeaked and which thermostats needed adjustment. He knew how to silence the rattling cartwheels and how to glide past security cameras without drawing a glance. He was invisible, but only because people had chosen not to see him. Tonight, as he passed room 204, a large echoing lecture hall with a 40-foot chalkboard, stretching wall to wall, something stopped him. A half-solved equation filled the board, written in urgent, messy chalk. Tensor fields, quantum loops, and symbols from deep within string theory, all scrawled in someone's flurry of thought. A piece of chalk sat abandoned beneath the problem like a dropped microphone. Franklin hesitated. Then he stepped inside, shutting the door gently behind him. He removed his gloves, dusted his hands, and stared at the equation with the intensity of a man looking into a mirror. Franklin wasn't just a janitor. He had once stood in rooms like this, not to clean, but to teach. Before life, or rather racism disguised as bureaucracy, had torn his path apart. A top physics graduate at MIT, a published researcher at 24, and a doctoral candidate with a thesis that frightened his white colleagues with how far ahead it was. Then, accusations of plagiarism from a senior professor. No hearing, no defense, just silence. His scholarship revoked, his name blacklisted, his life rerouted. So he mopped floors now. But his mind was still sharp. Franklin walked to the board, picked up the chalk and began again. He didn't rewrite the entire equation. He didn't need to. He started with a subtle shift, adjusting the order of matrix operations, re-evaluating a derivative that had been applied incorrectly. He moved with certainty, connecting steps like puzzle pieces. The air seemed to thicken around him, as his mind submerged deeper into the problem. It was as if the numbers were music, and he was tuning an instrument no one else could hear. Time disappeared. He didn't notice the door open behind him. Professor Douglas Avery entered briskly, followed by a sleepy-eyed graduate student named Carson. Avery was a rising academic star, recently tenured, frequently cited, and perpetually impatient. He'd returned to retrieve his laser pointer, and was halfway into the room before he registered the man at the board. He stopped cold. "Excuse me?" Avery's voice cut through the air like ice. Franklin froze, mid-symbol. The chalk trembled slightly in his hand. He turned slowly. The silence hung between them, like a loaded weapon. "I was just cleaning," Franklin said, stepping away from the board. Avery narrowed his eyes. "Cleaning with calculus?" Franklin opened his mouth, then closed it. The graduate student, visibly uncomfortable, stepped back. Avery walked closer to the board and scanned the modifications Franklin had made. His eyes followed the path of corrected logic, trailing along changes too accurate to ignore, but too threatening to acknowledge. "I don't know what delusion you are living in," Avery muttered. "But this," he gestured at the chalkboard, "is research for an international conference. This isn't open mic night for janitors." Franklin didn't react. The quiet strength in his face made the moment feel surreal, as if the roles had been reversed, and Avery was the one out of place. "I saw an inconsistency," Franklin said calmly. The third matrix application contradicted the earlier tensor expansion. It would have invalidated your assumption in step 7. Avery flinched at the words. He turned toward the grad student. "Are you hearing this?" Avery snapped. "He's trying to correct my tensor application. Maybe next he'll rewrite Einstein." Franklin didn't move. "I wasn't trying to disrespect your work." Avery stepped forward, lowering his voice to a condescending whisper. You clean the floors, Mr. Reed. Franklin Reed. Well, Mr. Reed, you clean the floors, you clean the boards, you don't solve them. There's a reason there's chalk in your hand, and not a name on the door. The graduate student took a nervous breath but said nothing. Franklin stared at the board, then slowly walked to the eraser. He began wiping away the chalk, motion deliberate. The beautiful corrections vanished, line by line. Avery watched him erase the work, as if removing Franklin's thoughts could restore the hierarchy. I'm sure you meant well, Avery added with a smirk, but in the future let's leave the heavy lifting to the professionals. Franklin finished erasing and walked toward the door. As he passed Avery, he paused. You might want to revisit your fourth row assumptions, he said quietly. You applied the tensor incorrectly. It contradicts your boundary limits. Just something to consider. He stepped out. Inside, the grad student walked up to the board, studying the faint traces left behind. He looked nervous. Professor, he said cautiously. I think he's right. Avery blinked. What? The boundary assumption. You did jump too early. If he's right, that collapses the next 5 steps. The model folds on itself. Avery didn't respond. He walked slowly back to the board, now mostly erased. He stared at the single symbol Franklin had left in the bottom corner. A tiny epsilon, repositioned with intention. A whisper of correction. A fingerprint of brilliance. Avery clenched his jaw. He was guessing, but his voice lacked conviction. Back in the janitor's closet, Franklin sat on a stool, his mop propped beside him. He opened his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a printed copy of the equation he'd worked on tonight. Avery had left it behind after lecture, and Franklin had found it during his cleaning rounds. He studied the sheet, then scribbled a note on the back. Solution lies in fourth-order simplification. Tensor collapse near threshold. He folded it again, and without thinking, slipped it into his jacket pocket. That's when he heard footsteps behind him. It was his son, Elijah, 17, sharp-eyed, and always 2 steps from boiling over. Elijah came by most nights when his dad worked late shifts, bringing dinner or just to walk him home. But tonight, Elijah's eyes fell on the paper sticking out of Franklin's jacket pocket. What's that? He asked. Franklin didn't answer. Elijah pulled the paper gently, turned it over, and his eyes widened. This is Stanford-level work. Franklin said nothing. His silence said everything. Elijah stared at him, hurt blooming behind his eyes. Why didn't you tell me you were doing this? Franklin looked away. Because it's not my job anymore. Elijah's voice cracked. But it should be. There was pain in that silence. Generations of it. Elijah's eyes returned to the equation. He recognized it. It had been labeled unsolvable in a Stanford publication last year. A challenge posed by Avery himself. And now, here it was, being quietly corrected by a janitor no one saw. His father. His father, the invisible genius. Franklin stood up and picked up the mop again. He reached for the gloves. Let's go home, he said. But Elijah stayed frozen in place, holding the paper, staring at the fading chalk on the board, and thinking one thing. If they wouldn't give Franklin Reed a voice, then he'd find a way to speak for him. Elijah folds the paper and slips it into his backpack, determined to make sure someone somewhere finally sees what his father has done. And across campus, the graduate student begins typing an anonymous blog post. The janitor who rewrote physics. Morning came slowly through the cracked blinds of Franklin Reed's small apartment, just off Menlo Park. The place was quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Every corner carried the weight of restraint. The floors were clean, the furniture modest, and the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and reheated coffee. It was the kind of space where nothing broke because nothing could afford to be replaced. Franklin stood in the kitchen, stirring his coffee with the same deliberate care he used to erase chalkboards. Across the table sat his son, Elijah, silently chewing a piece of toast. The tension between them felt recent, but its roots ran deep. On the wall, one photo hung alone, a graduation picture. A younger Franklin, tall and confident, in a cap and gown, flanked by his proud mother, and a woman with a hesitant smile, Elijah's mother. The photo was cracked in one corner. The frame yellowed. Franklin glanced at Elijah. You didn't have to wait for me last night. I wasn't tired, Elijah replied flatly. Franklin sipped his coffee. I saw you looking at that paper. Elijah didn't deny it. He reached into his hoodie pocket and slowly unfolded the page. His eyes scanned it again, as if trying to solve not just the equation but the man across from him. "This is real, isn't it?" he asked. "You really corrected a Stanford problem." Franklin set the mug down. "It's not about that."
Then what is it about?
Elijah's voice rose. "You're solving physics problems better than their professors. But you mop their floors. I do what I need to do." "For who?" Elijah snapped. "For them? Or for you?" Franklin leaned back in his chair, eyes dimming. "For us." Elijah clenched his jaw. "You could be teaching. You could be writing papers, giving lectures. You could have been somebody." "I was," Franklin said softly. And for the first time in years, he began to talk. It was 1987. Franklin was a doctoral candidate at MIT, working under one of the most respected physicists in the country, Dr. Howard Lasker. Franklin had been a standout. His thesis, an elegant unification theory proposal, had stunned the faculty. There were whispers he'd be the youngest black physicist to ever hold a named chair. But that kind of brilliance, from someone who looked like him, came at a price. At first it was subtle, missing citations, delayed approvals, lost applications for grants. Then came the accusation. Lasker claimed Franklin had plagiarized sections of a published Russian paper, a paper Franklin had never seen. There was no review, no chance to defend himself. One meeting, one verdict. His funding disappeared within a week. His research access was revoked. His academic record was sealed with a quiet stain. And just like that, Franklin Reed was no longer a rising star. He became a ghost. The only job he could find was as a night cleaner at a lab in Palo Alto. From there he drifted, cleaning offices, buffing floors, watching others present theories he once dreamed of. Eventually Stanford hired him as a full-time janitor, but he never stopped solving. Every night after lectures ended, he'd sneak into classrooms and work through the problems left behind. Sometimes they were unsolvable puzzles left as challenges. Other times they were careless errors by overconfident professors. Either way, Franklin kept the equations in a battered notebook. His mind stayed sharp, even as the world refused to see it. Back at the table, Elijah sat stunned. "All these years," he said, his voice trembling, "you never told me any of this." "I didn't want you to grow up bitter," Franklin said. "And I didn't want you to feel like life had to break you too." "But it already did," Elijah whispered. "I see how they look at you. Like you're nothing." Franklin's voice was calm but steel-lined. "They don't have to see me. I see myself." "But why stay at Stanford?" Elijah asked. "Why be near the place that buried you?" Franklin looked out the window, his eyes far away. "Because knowledge lives there. Equations don't judge who solves them. And one day someone might notice, even if it's just once." Elijah looked down at the paper in his hand again. The equation was still partially erased, but Franklin's corrections stood out. They weren't just accurate, they were elegant. A beat passed between them. Then Elijah asked, "You still have the notebook?" Franklin hesitated, then reached beneath the table and pulled out a weathered composition book, duct-taped along the spine. He slid it over. Elijah opened it slowly. Inside were pages and pages of theoretical problems, solutions, side notes, and philosophical musings about particle behavior, time symmetry, dark energy, all handwritten, all brilliant. Elijah turned the pages like he was holding a holy book. "This is yours?" Franklin nodded. Elijah swallowed hard. "Then it's mine too." Later that night, Franklin sat alone on the worn couch, watching the ceiling fan turn like a slow metronome. The house was quiet, but his mind raced. He'd always believed that genius without recognition was still genius. That solving problems mattered even if no one knew. But watching Elijah look at him, not with pity, but with wonder, had cracked something inside. For the first time in decades, Franklin wasn't sure he wanted to be invisible anymore. Meanwhile, in Elijah's room, the teenager sat on the edge of his bed, holding the notebook open in his lap. He had always known his father was quiet. He'd always assumed it came from being tired, or being humble. But now he understood it came from something deeper, the weight of being erased. Elijah reached for his laptop. He opened a new search tab and typed, "Stanford Unsolved Equation 2024, Professor Avery." The same symbols from the page in his hoodie appeared in the search results. It was a known open problem, one Avery had presented at a symposium and declared too incomplete to finish. Elijah's heart pounded. His father had solved a piece of it. Quietly, alone. He clicked on a university forum and began typing anonymously. "My dad is a janitor. He just corrected an equation your tenured professor couldn't finish." You don't know his name, but you will. He stared at the post for a long moment before hitting send. Somewhere deep in his gut, Elijah knew this wasn't just about proving his father's worth. It was about opening a door for every mind that had ever been ignored, dismissed, or erased. In the early hours of the morning, Franklin left for his shift. He wore the same faded uniform, the same steel-toed boots, and carried the same mop handle that people mistook as the symbol of his limits. But inside his jacket pocket, he carried the same page Elijah had stared at all night. He didn't know yet that it had already been seen by hundreds of Stanford students online, or that in one small corner of the campus internet, people had started calling him the ghost theorist. As Franklin punches in for his shift, Elijah opens his phone and sees a new comment on his anonymous post. I saw that equation too. If your dad wrote it, he's not just a janitor, he's a genius. Tell him to check room 204. Midnight. The buzzing of Elijah's phone cut through the early morning stillness. He hadn't slept, not really. After what he'd seen in that notebook, and what he now knew about his father, there was no room for rest. The light from the screen flickered across his face as he scrolled, eyes bloodshot but burning. Dozens of new notifications. His anonymous post, a raw outburst against Stanford's silent racism, had spread like wildfire across a few campus forums and Reddit threads. Overnight, he reread what he had written just hours earlier. My father was a physicist before your institutions erased him. He solved an equation your top Stanford professor couldn't finish. Now he mops the same floors those professors walk on. If that's not racism, tell me what is. He'd posted it with shaking hands, unsure if anyone would care. They did. The top comment was seared into his brain. I saw that equation too. If your dad wrote it, he's not just a janitor. He's a ghost genius. Tell him to check room 204. Midnight. Elijah couldn't breathe for a moment. He rubbed his temples, thoughts spiraling. Room 204. That was where Franklin had made his quiet correction. Someone had seen it. Someone knew. He jumped from the edge of his bed and stormed into the living room. Franklin sat on the worn couch, boots still muddy from his night shift. He looked older than usual, like the silence was finally weighing too heavy on his shoulders. Elijah didn't hesitate. You gonna tell me the truth? He demanded, voice trembling with fury. Franklin looked up, startled. Elijah, it's early. No, Elijah cut him off. No more quiet, no more later. You were a physicist. You were a physicist. You were buried, Dad. Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? Franklin let out a slow breath, gaze dropping to the floor. Because the truth is heavy. And you were too young. Elijah stepped forward, waving the notebook in his hand. Too young to know my father got erased. That a white professor took your future and no one said a word? I didn't want you to grow up bitter. Well, guess what? Elijah snapped. I'm bitter anyway. Franklin winced but didn't speak. You let them take your voice, Elijah said. Softer now, but still trembling. And you let me believe you were just some guy who liked numbers. You were a genius, and you said nothing while they walked all over you. Franklin's jaw tightened. It's not about who knows. It's about what survives. That's not true, Elijah said. Not when you're black. Not when the world doesn't give you credit unless you demand it. Franklin stood slowly, the weight in his posture unmistakable. You think I didn't fight? I fought every day. I fought when they erased my papers, when they denied my appeals, when I couldn't get work. I fought when they looked me in the face and pretended they didn't know my name, the same name that was in their footnotes. And I fought when I walked back into Stanford with a mop, and not a briefcase. That fight doesn't look like rage. It looks like endurance. Elijah looked down, hands shaking, the notebook trembling between his fingers. Franklin softened. I stayed close to that university not because I gave up, but because I couldn't let it win. Every night I solved problems on those boards. I was reminding myself that they didn't break me. They just tried to. Elijah blinked fast. Why didn't you at least publish under a different name? Make them see. Franklin shook his head. You think they read submissions from men like me without credentials? Without letters of recommendation? Without access? He looked Elijah in the eye. It's not just the work that matters, it's who they believe did the work. The truth landed like a hammer. Elijah backed away slowly, the notebook still in his hand. Then maybe they'll believe me. And with that he turned and disappeared into his room. It took Elijah less than an hour to set the internet ablaze. He found a Reddit group dedicated to academic injustice, a subreddit on anonymous confessions, and a small student-run Stanford forum. He uploaded a blurry image of the notebook's equation. Franklin's handwriting, his notation style, his final correction to the Stanford problem. He typed in a fury, heart pounding. This equation was solved by a black janitor at Stanford, who's been working in silence for over 20 years. His name is Franklin Reed. He's my father. He was once a PhD candidate at MIT, until a senior white professor destroyed his future with a false plagiarism charge. This is what racism in academia looks like. It erases, discredits, and buries. Well, not anymore. He hit post and stared at the screen. The responses came fast. He can't be serious. A janitor? Where's the proof he was ever a student? You're making this up for attention. This would have gone viral already, if it were real. But mixed in were voices that hit differently. There's been a rumor about a janitor who solves equations in room 204 late at night. Thought it was a myth. One time I came in early and saw a correction on the board that didn't match any professor's handwriting. We call him the chalk ghost. The story was building momentum, but not everyone wanted to hear it. At school, Elijah's day didn't start any easier. His AP physics teacher, Mr. Hensley, wore a neatly ironed shirt and the kind of smile that always felt slightly off. He opened class with a discussion about college admissions. Stanford is a reach for most students, he began. Elite schools want more than just good test scores. They want a story, a perfect fit. Elijah raised his hand. What if the story is being better than the people teaching there? A few students snickered. Hensley smirked. I suppose that would be a compelling narrative. But let's be realistic. These institutions, they look for polish, certain backgrounds, certain colors? Elijah asked, loud enough for the back row to hear. Hensley's eyes narrowed. Tone, Elijah. No, I think tone's exactly the problem, Elijah said. I talk about racism, and its tone. I challenge the system, and its attitude. Meanwhile, you're telling me I don't fit. The room went quiet. After class, Hensley pulled Elijah aside. I understand you're passionate, he said quietly. But don't sabotage yourself. Be strategic. Pick colleges that align with your circumstances. Elijah stepped closer. You mean pick colleges that expect less of me? Where I don't make anyone uncomfortable. Hensley didn't respond. And Elijah walked out. By evening, Elijah's posts had been shared over 10,000 times. A Stanford alumni Twitter account had retweeted the thread with the caption, "If this is true, Stanford has some explaining to do." A screenshot of the equation had made its way to a physics subreddit, where users debated its accuracy, some defending it, others dismissing it, but none could deny it had been corrected, and none could explain by whom. That's when Elijah got the message. A private DM from an anonymous Stanford grad student. I saw what your dad wrote. He's not just smart, he's a ghost genius. Everyone whispers about him. The man who solves the problems and disappears before dawn. I didn't believe it, until I saw the board after he left. It wasn't just right. It was beautiful. Elijah's hands went cold. He typed back immediately. Who are you? The reply came fast. Doesn't matter. But people are watching now. If you want them to really listen, bring the proof. Lecture Hall 5C. Friday night. After hours. I'll be there. And so will others. Elijah stared at the screen. He closed the laptop, heart pounding. Meanwhile, Franklin sat at the kitchen table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee. His hands were still dusted with chalk from the night before. But it wasn't the math that occupied his mind. It was the noise, the posts, the growing online storm. The way Elijah had looked at him, with awe, yes, but also anger. He had tried so long to live quietly, believing that dignity meant endurance. But maybe he had been wrong. Maybe silence wasn't noble. Maybe it was surrender. He stood slowly and walked to Elijah's room, knocking once before opening the door. I saw what you wrote, he said softly. Elijah turned around, startled. Franklin held out the notebook. If you're going to show them who I am, do it with this. Elijah took it, his voice cracking. You're sure? Franklin nodded. Let them see what they tried to bury. As Elijah clutches the notebook, a new email pings in his inbox. From a Stanford journalist. We're investigating a quiet scandal involving Dr. Douglas Avery. Do you know anything about an equation he claimed as his own? The revolution didn't begin with headlines or protests. It started with whispers. A single blog appeared online, buried in the back corners of the web, minimal design, no ads, no credits, just white text on a black background, and a cryptic title that sounded more like fiction than fact. Room 204. Traces of a Ghost. At first, no one knew who created it. But its post spoke of strange sightings late at night in the physics wing at Stanford. Specifically room 204. Equations left behind after lectures, corrected with surgical precision. Unsolved problems from world-renowned professors restructured, redefined and quietly left without explanation. The first post was timestamped 3. This correction appeared after Professor Avery's seminar on tensor boundaries. The original proof collapsed under his fourth-row assumption. But by morning, the equation had changed. Clean, elegant, solved. The janitor was seen exiting the room minutes before. The blog included a grainy, low-lit photo of the chalkboard. Most readers wouldn't have known what they were looking at, but those who understood math at that level knew. Something genius had happened here. Quietly, invisibly. More posts followed. More sightings. More whisper evidence. Students began referring to the mystery man as the ghost theorist. Within a week, the blog had 15,000 views. Franklin Reed had become an academic myth. Elijah watched all of it unfold from the cracked screen of his phone, alone in his room. The blog updates, the reposts on Twitter, the discussions on niche subreddits and Stanford student message boards. It was slow, but it was growing. And yet it wasn't enough. His father's name still wasn't attached to the story. He was just a ghost, an idea, a whisper, not a man, not the man who'd raised Elijah on principles of quiet dignity and buried genius. To Elijah, this wasn't justice. It was a half-truth. A viral rumor. He wanted reality. He wanted recognition. He wanted faces to turn when Franklin walked into a room. Not because he was holding a mop, but because he was the man who had rewritten problems that tenured faculty had called unsolvable. Meanwhile at Stanford, Professor Douglas Avery was beginning to feel the heat. He first noticed it in his lecture halls. A few students whispering before class. Others asking oddly specific questions, poking at the cracks in his math. Professor, one student asked during a seminar, "What's your current thinking on the boundary contradiction in your Copenhagen expansion?" Avery hesitated too long. That equation. That damned equation. The one he had been using for his upcoming symposium paper. The one Franklin had casually fixed. Avery had corrected it afterward. Of course. Quietly. Publicly. He took credit for the refinement. But the blog posts were spreading, and somehow the correction matched what was left on the chalkboard that night. He began erasing his boards completely after class. Every lecture, he wiped down the entire surface. Chalk residue, side notes. All of it. He even began locking room 24 before leaving. But it didn't matter. The next morning, a new blog post went live. Despite locked doors, room 204 had a fresh correction on the particle interaction model. The janitor was seen on the second floor just after midnight. Either he's breaking in, or he was never really out. Avery's paranoia deepened. He requested a formal meeting with the department chair, claiming someone was sabotaging his lectures. The chair chuckled. "Doug, it's just chalk. Let the students have their ghost stories." But it wasn't a story to Avery. It was a threat. One afternoon, a blurry photo appeared on the anonymous blog. It wasn't of the board. It was of Franklin. He stood in room 204, unaware, head slightly turned toward the chalkboard, white piece of chalk still in hand. His expression was neutral, focused, almost serene. The caption underneath was simple. "This is the ghost." The post exploded across private Stanford group chats. Some laughed. Others speculated. A few defended him. Most didn't know what to think. But one thing became clear. The ghost was real, and he had a face. Franklin noticed the stares. Students who had once passed him without a glance now held their eyes longer. A few nodded subtly as he walked by. One even whispered, "Thank you," when she passed him in the hallway. Franklin didn't acknowledge it. But when he entered room 204 that evening and saw a completely blank board, scrubbed clean, even the chalk tray removed, he paused. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of chalk he'd started keeping with him. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote a short equation. Just one, underlined it, and walked out. By morning the blog had updated again. He's not hiding anymore. He's claiming space. Back home, Elijah watched it all unfold, with growing tension. He wanted to celebrate the photo, the attention, the myth. But none of it said his father's name. None of it called out the injustice. None of it touched the racism that had erased Franklin in the first place. He wasn't content with subtlety. He wanted truth. Friday came. Professor Avery was scheduled to present a lecture open to the public. A refinement of his Copenhagen model, the very one Franklin had fixed weeks ago. Elijah put on his hoodie, tucked the notebook into his backpack, and slipped into the back of Lecture Hall 5C just before the session began. The room buzzed with anticipation. Avery stepped onto the stage, smiling like a man unaware his mask was slipping. He began the lecture with confidence, walking through old equations, arriving at his updated version. No acknowledgement of help. No footnotes. No corrections. Just stolen polish. Elijah couldn't stay quiet. He stood. "Excuse me," he called out. Avery paused. "This is a closed Q&A. I just have one question," Elijah said, moving toward the aisle. "When you applied the tensor limit on the fourth row, didn't that directly contradict your original boundary assumptions?" Avery froze for a beat. "That's an advanced detail," he replied stiffly. "Not relevant for today's audience. But it's relevant to the truth," Elijah said, louder now. "Because that correction, the one you're presenting, it came from a janitor. My father, Franklin Reed." Gasps erupted around the room. Elijah stepped forward, holding up the notebook. "This is his work. Dated. Solved. Documented. You didn't refine this. You copied it." Avery's face turned crimson. "I think we've heard enough," he barked. But no one moved. Another voice rose from the front row. "I've seen him," a graduate student said. "In room 204. I thought it was just a rumor, but he solved a problem we'd been stuck on for weeks." Another voice chimed in. "He fixed my project. I found the chalk correction the next day." Phones were coming out, cameras pointing. The crowd buzzed with disbelief and growing support. Avery reached for the mic. "Security." But before he could finish, a voice from the back of the room silenced everyone. "Don't touch him." The crowd turned. A woman in a Stanford faculty badge stood slowly, gray curls, eyes sharp with memory. "I remember Franklin Reed," she said. "I was there the day his name disappeared." Elijah turns toward the woman in disbelief, and she steps down the stairs, saying, "It's time Stanford tells the truth. I have something you'll all want to see." There was a stillness in Lecture Hall 5C, but it wasn't silence, it was tension. The moment the older professor stood from the back row and declared, "I remember Franklin Reed," the atmosphere turned electric. Whispers ignited instantly. Heads swiveled. Even the grad students who had doubted Elijah moments before now leaned forward in disbelief. Professor Douglas Avery stood rigid behind the podium, his face stiff, arms crossed defensively, as if he could will this moment into vanishing. But it wasn't going away. Not now. Elijah remained where he stood, notebook still in hand. His heart thundered in his chest, but his voice stayed steady. The woman walked slowly down the aisle, her Stanford faculty badge glinting under the lecture lights. She had presence, not loud, but authoritative. "My name is Dr. Lenora Campbell," she said. "I taught in the Department of Applied Mathematics for 31 years. I served on the faculty review committee in the 80s, back when Franklin Reed was one of the most brilliant PhD candidates we had ever seen." Elijah's breath caught. Dr. Campbell reached the front of the room, turned to face the crowd. "And I remember the day they buried his career." Very shifted. "This isn't the time." Dr. Campbell silenced him with a glance. "Doug, you've had plenty of time. You presented Franklin's work today, his corrections, his intuition, and passed it off as your own. So, yes, I think this is exactly the time." The crowd went still. Phones lifted. Recordings rolled. Campbell turned to Elijah. "I remember your father. He wasn't just smart. He was luminous. He was working on quantum loop theories before most people even understood how to describe them. And then he was accused without due process of stealing work he had proven months earlier in front of peers. The department said there wasn't sufficient evidence to continue supporting him." A student in the front gasped. "They didn't just end his education," she continued. "They made sure he couldn't enroll elsewhere. Blackballed him. Quietly. Efficiently. And now, I see his fingerprints again. In your notebook. In that equation." In Avery's mouth. All eyes turned back to Professor Avery. He tried to smile, a forced diplomatic one. "Dr. Campbell, we're talking about an informal chalk note, which became your published correction," she interrupted. "Doug, you locked rooms after class, you erased boards, you pushed to have Franklin reassigned. That's not normal behavior, unless you're hiding something." The words landed with weight. Elijah, still standing beside the podium, took one final step forward. "I just asked a question," he said, "about a contradiction in his math, and instead of answering it, he tried to have me removed." The lecture hall erupted in whispers, outrage, disbelief. Avery's carefully curated academic image cracked, right there in front of students, faculty, and digital witnesses. He cleared his throat. This is being blown out of proportion. But no one was listening anymore. Just outside the room, Franklin stood against the hallway wall, hidden from sight but not from sound. He heard every word. Dr. Campbell's voice, familiar, steady. Elijah's calm strength, the ripple of truth moving through the very institution that had once pretended he didn't exist. He didn't step inside. He didn't need to. For once they were saying his name, not as a footnote, not as a cautionary tale, but as a man who mattered. The next few days moved like an earthquake in slow motion. Clips from the confrontation went viral. Not just on Stanford's campus, but beyond. The footage of Dr. Campbell calling out Avery, of Elijah holding up the notebook, of students gasping. It spread across TikTok, Instagram Reels, and Twitter. Hashtags exploded. Franklin Reed, the real ghost, stolen genius, chalk justice, Stanford silence. Dozens of academic watchdog pages picked up the story. Some praised the boldness. Others demanded full investigations. Then came the media. A regional journalist wrote an article titled, "The Janitor Who Corrected Stanford." Within hours, national outlets reached out. Requests for interviews flooded both Elijah and Franklin's inboxes, most of which went unanswered. But on campus, the tone had changed. People treated Franklin differently now. Some with awe, others with guilt. Some students nodded respectfully. A few left thank you notes on his cart. One professor tried to apologize in a rushed hallway encounter. But none of it sat comfortably with Franklin. He hadn't asked for the spotlight. He hadn't tried to go viral. He had just wanted to stay close to the equations, and to Elijah. At home, Elijah sat on the couch, scrolling through headlines. His phone buzzed constantly. He turned to his father. "They want to put you on a panel at MIT. Talk about your early work." Franklin didn't respond. "And Stanford students want to meet you. They're organizing a petition to reinstate your name in the university archives." Still, silent. "You're a legend now," Elijah said, trying to sound light. But Franklin only looked out the window. "I'm still the janitor." "No," Elijah said. "You're the professor they tried to erase." Franklin nodded, slowly. "Try." But just as the tide seemed to turn, it shifted again. On a cloudy Thursday morning, a formal letter appeared in Franklin's staff mailbox at Stanford. It was printed on university letterhead. Crisp, cold, devoid of emotion. Subject: disciplinary review notification. Unauthorized use of university property. Date: immediate. Franklin read it 3 times before sitting down on the bench outside the janitorial office. The letter accused him of accessing secured academic spaces without authorization, of interfering with instructional materials, and engaging in unapproved intellectual activity under false identity. There was no mention of the viral story, no reference to the accuracy of his work, no acknowledgement of the injustice now public knowledge, just bureaucracy, reasserting control. Franklin folded the paper and slid it into his jacket pocket. Moments later, Elijah burst through the staff entrance, breathless. "Dad, I just saw the email." Franklin didn't look up. "They're trying to punish you now?" Elijah said, furious. "After everything?"
They always do.
Franklin said quietly. "When they can't deny you, they discipline you. They're calling it unauthorized use?" Elijah scoffed. "You corrected them. You saved them from publishing garbage." Franklin smiled, bitterly. "Doesn't matter if you're right when the system's built to protect those who are wrong, as long as they have power." Elijah crouched beside him. "Then we'll fight. We'll take it public again." Franklin nodded. "I know. But this time," Elijah said, pulling out his phone, "you won't be alone." That night, Elijah posted a new video. This time, he showed Franklin reading the disciplinary letter aloud. He didn't yell. He didn't rant. He just read the words, slowly, clearly, letting their absurdity echo. Then Elijah spoke directly to the camera. "This is what happens when a black man dares to be smarter than the system meant to erase him. My father didn't steal chalk. He gave Stanford back its credibility. And now they want to punish him for existing in a space he belonged to all along." The video reached 100,000 views in 48. Among the viewers, journalists, activists, former Stanford alumni, and one unexpected person, a Stanford Board of Trustees member. The following morning, Franklin received another letter. This one marked confidential, board review request. It read, Mr. Reed, you are hereby requested to appear before the Stanford Board of Trustees for a confidential hearing regarding allegations of unauthorized academic participation and potential ethics violations. But what caught his eye was the final line. You are permitted to bring representation. The board will also hear from key faculty witnesses, including Dr. Lenora Campbell. Franklin lowered the letter slowly. Elijah stood in the doorway, watching. What is it? Franklin looked up. They want me to explain why I solved a problem they couldn't. As Franklin prepares for the hearing, Elijah opens his email and finds a message from an Ivy League professor. We followed your father's story, but this goes deeper than one equation. Can we talk about a pattern of buried black excellence across academia? Franklin stood alone in the center of a room that reeked of polished power. Mahogany walls, high-backed leather chairs, a long table where policy decisions were dressed in politeness but carved in stone. The Stanford Board of Trustees sat in a half-circle, each member holding a neatly bound file with his name printed on the cover. Franklin J. Reed, conduct review. Not professor, not doctor, just Mr. The chairwoman, poised behind a silver nameplate, cleared her throat. We appreciate you joining us today, Mr. Reed. As you know, this is a formal inquiry regarding your use of academic spaces and instructional materials without authorization. It is not a disciplinary hearing, yet. Franklin didn't flinch. A panelist leaned forward. You are aware, we presume, that interacting with unresolved equations on university property, especially in sensitive research environments, can constitute academic interference. I was cleaning the boards, Franklin said, voice even. That's my job. Then how do you explain the corrections? I used chalk. No one laughed. Dr. Lenora Campbell, seated at the far end, spoke up. What Mr. Reed did was not interference. It was intellectual contribution, and long overdue acknowledgement. The chairwoman gave a tight smile. That's outside the scope of today's discussion. Elijah sat in the gallery, fuming. His father had walked into this room, with his chin high. But this was another burial. Polite, documented, padded with procedural language. A slow lynching by policy. When they left the building, Elijah exploded. They're not even trying to pretend anymore. This is revenge. They're trying to punish you for being right. Franklin was quiet. You're just going to let them do this? Elijah demanded. Franklin kept walking. You sat in that room and let them treat you like a criminal. I've been treated like one for 30 years, Franklin interrupted. You don't survive this long by reacting to every slap. Some cuts you absorb. Others you make bleed later. Elijah stopped walking. But how can you stay so calm? Franklin turned. Because I've already lost everything once. This time, they can't take what I never asked them to give. But Elijah wouldn't let it go. That night, he posted again. This time, not anonymously. He went live. Behind him, the now famous notebook lay open. The chalk equations were framed next to news clippings, blog screenshots, and photos of Franklin mopping lecture halls. Stanford wants to fire my father for solving their equations, Elijah said into the camera. They called it defacing property. They called it interference. But the truth is, they're terrified, not of what he did, but who did it. This isn't about chalk. This is about color. About a black man being better than the professors who erased him. The video racked up 60,000 views in 12 hours. By morning, campus was a battlefield, not of violence but of ideology. Posters went up around the quad. Justice for Franklin Reed. Intellect isn't white. Who really owns the chalkboard? Elijah joined a coalition of students from the Black Student Union, the physics department, and even the Graduate Student Senate. They launched a petition, reinstate Franklin Reed's academic record, grant him retroactive authorship, stop the disciplinary action. Within 3 days, it had over 12,000 signatures. But not everyone celebrated. Professor Douglas Avery wasn't done. Frustrated by the momentum Elijah had built, he turned his attention to the boy directly. In a faculty-only email thread leaked to a student journalist, Avery wrote, "While I understand the sentimentality around Mr. Reed's son, it's important to note that he is in fact a high school student with no formal mathematical training. His attacks on faculty should be treated accordingly, as emotional, not intellectual." Let's not confuse viral fame with academic merit. The father may have contributed something, though I remain skeptical. But the son is simply riding a wave of outrage. The email leaked. It didn't help Avery's case. That afternoon, Elijah stood outside the lecture hall, with a bullhorn in hand. He didn't shout. He read Avery's email aloud, word for word, as hundreds of students listened. Then he said, "They said I was untrained, that I couldn't possibly understand what I was defending. But guess what? I understand enough to know the difference between theft and credit, between silence and truth, between someone who teaches and someone who takes. I may not have a degree, but I have eyes, and I see what they're doing." We all see it. The crowd roared. Franklin watched from the side, quiet, proud, worried. He had never wanted Elijah in this fire. But now that he was in it, he was holding the flame better than most adults ever could. Later that night, the doorbell rang at their apartment. Franklin opened it and found an elderly black man in a gray overcoat, cane in hand, and eyes sharp despite age. "Franklin," the man said, "you probably don't remember me, but I knew you back in '84. Name's Dr. Harold West. Retired now. Used to teach at Columbia." Franklin froze. "Dr. West?" Harold smiled. "That's right. You were the young brother who turned heads at MIT. Had all the white boys sweating in seminar rooms." Franklin chuckled. Stunned, Dr. West stepped inside. "I've been watching what's happening," he said. "You've handled it better than I ever could have, but I need you to know something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, yellowed with age. Inside, pages from Franklin's original dissertation. "Copied. Preserved." "I kept a copy," Dr. West said, "because I knew they were going to bury it. And I wanted a record. Not just for you, for us." Franklin sat down, emotion swelling behind his eyes. Dr. West continued, "I knew your father in the '80s. He was better than any of us. Smarter, quieter. But they couldn't handle his mind, just like they couldn't handle yours." Elijah stood in the doorway, listening. "You're not the only one they tried to erase, Franklin," West said. "But you're the first they couldn't." Dr. West leaned in, voice low. "I know about others too. Names you wouldn't believe. If Stanford's ready for truth, we might as well tell all of it." Franklin stood alone in the center of a room that reeked of polished power. Mahogany walls, high-backed leather chairs, a long table where policy decisions were dressed in politeness, but carved in stone. The Stanford Board of Trustees sat in a half-circle, each member holding a neatly bound file with his name printed on the cover. Franklin J. Reed. Conduct review. Not professor. Not doctor. Just Mr. The chairwoman, poised behind a silver nameplate, cleared her throat. "We appreciate you joining us today, Mr. Reed. As you know, this is a formal inquiry regarding your use of academic spaces and instructional materials without authorization. It is not a disciplinary hearing yet." Franklin didn't flinch. A panelist leaned forward. "You are aware, we presume, that interacting with unresolved equations on university property, especially in sensitive research environments, can constitute academic interference." "I was cleaning the boards," Franklin said, voice even. "That's my job." "Then how do you explain the corrections?" "I used chalk." No one laughed. Dr. Lenora Campbell, seated at the far end, spoke up. "What Mr. Reed did was not interference. It was intellectual contribution, and long overdue acknowledgement." The chairwoman gave a tight smile. "That's outside the scope of today's discussion." Elijah sat in the gallery, fuming. His father had walked into this room with his chin high, but this was another burial. Polite, documented, padded with procedural language. A slow lynching by policy. When they left the building, Elijah exploded. "They're not even trying to pretend anymore. This is revenge. They're trying to punish you for being right." Franklin was quiet. "You're just going to let them do this?" Elijah demanded. Franklin kept walking. "You sat in that room and let them treat you like a criminal." "I've been treated like one for 30 years, Franklin interrupted. "You don't survive this long by reacting to every slap. Some cuts you absorb, others you make bleed later." Elijah stopped walking. "But how can you stay so calm?" Franklin turned. "Because I've already lost everything once. This time they can't take what I never asked them to give." But Elijah wouldn't let it go. That night, he posted again. This time, not anonymously. He went live. Behind him, the now famous notebook lay open. The chalk equations were framed next to news clippings, blog screenshots, and photos of Franklin mopping lecture halls. Stanford wants to fire my father for solving their equations, Elijah said into the camera. They called it defacing property. They called it interference. But the truth is, they're terrified. Not of what he did, but who did. This isn't about chalk. This is about color. About a black man being better than the professors who erased him. The video racked up 60,000 views in 12 hours. By morning, campus was a battlefield, not of violence, but of ideology. Posters went up around the quad. Justice for Franklin Reed. Intellect isn't white. Who really owns the chalkboard? Elijah joined a coalition of students from the Black Student Union, the physics department, and even the Graduate Student Senate. They launched a petition, reinstate Franklin Reed's academic record, grant him retroactive authorship, stop the disciplinary action. Within 3 days, it had over 12,000 signatures. But not everyone celebrated. Professor Douglas Avery wasn't done. Frustrated by the momentum Elijah had built, he turned his attention to the boy directly. In a faculty-only email thread leaked to a student journalist, Avery wrote, "While I understand the sentimentality around Mr. Reed's son, it's important to note that he is, in fact, a high school student with no formal mathematical training. His attacks on faculty should be treated accordingly, as emotional, not intellectual. Let's not confuse viral fame with academic merit. The father may have contributed something, though I remain skeptical, but the son is simply riding a wave of outrage." The email leaked. It didn't help Avery's case. That afternoon, Elijah stood outside the lecture hall, with a bullhorn in hand. He didn't shout. He read Avery's email aloud, word for word, as hundreds of students listened. Then he said, "They said I was untrained, that I couldn't possibly understand what I was defending, but guess what? I understand enough to know the difference between theft and credit, between silence and truth, between someone who teaches and someone who takes. I may not have a degree, but I have eyes, and I see what they're doing." We all see it. The crowd roared. Franklin watched from the side, quiet, proud, worried. He had never wanted Elijah in this fire, but now that he was in it, he was holding the flame better than most adults ever could. Later that night, the doorbell rang at their apartment. Franklin opened it and found an elderly black man in a gray overcoat, cane in hand, and eyes sharp despite age. "Franklin," the man said, "you probably don't remember me, but I knew you back in '84. Name's Dr. Harold West. Retired now. Used to teach at Columbia." Franklin froze. "Dr. West?" Harold smiled. "That's right. You were the young brother who turned heads at MIT. Had all the white boys sweating in seminar rooms." Franklin chuckled, stunned. Dr. West stepped inside. "I've been watching what's happening," he said. "You've handled it better than I ever could have, but I need you to know something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, yellowed with age. Inside, pages from Franklin's original dissertation, copied, preserved. "I kept a copy," Dr. West said, "because I knew they were going to bury it, and I wanted a record. Not just for you, for us." Franklin sat down, emotion swelling behind his eyes. Dr. West continued, "I knew your father in the '80s. He was better than any of us. Smarter, quieter, but they couldn't handle his mind. Just like they couldn't handle yours." Elijah stood in the doorway, listening. "You're not the only one they tried to erase, Franklin," West said. "But you're the first they couldn't." Dr. West leaned in, voice low. "I know about others too, names you wouldn't believe. If Stanford's ready for truth, we might as well tell all of it." The apartment was quiet, heavy with memory. On the table lay the folder, old, faded, but intact. A relic from another life. Franklin stared at it as if it might vanish again. Inside were the pages of a paper titled, "Quantized Field Behavior in Non-Euclidean Space, A Bridge Between Loop Theory and Relativistic Mass." Author Franklin J. Reed. MIT. Handwritten notes in the margins, diagrams sketched with ink and ruler precision, and references that were ahead of their time. The kind of paper that should have launched a career. Instead, it had been buried. Franklin gently turned each page as if touching a wound that never healed. Dr. Harold West, sitting across from him, watched silently. "I remember the day you handed me a draft," West said. "I told you it would change the conversation. You were 26 and rewriting gravity like it was a crossword." Franklin gave a small, bitter smile, and then it disappeared. West nodded. "Not by accident. Back in 1984, Franklin had stood on the cusp of brilliance. He wasn't just a promising PhD candidate at MIT. He was a prodigy. His research, focusing on unifying quantum mechanics with general relativity using non-Euclidean geometry, was something only a handful of people on Earth could even follow. He submitted his draft to Professor Malcolm Vance, a senior white physicist known as much for his ego as his influence. Franklin had been advised to go through proper channels, and Vance controlled one of the biggest publishing pipelines at the time. Vance called it ambitious, but refused to endorse it for peer review. 2 weeks later, Franklin was blindsided by a formal charge of academic misconduct. The accusation? That he had lifted ideas from a Soviet-era thesis published in a rarely circulated Russian journal. Franklin had never even heard of it. He asked for a hearing. He was denied. He asked for evidence. He was handed a printed translation with no authorship, no citation. Within 3 weeks, his scholarship was revoked. His lab access terminated. His advisor reassigned. His visa at the time connected to his academic standing, placed under review. His name was wiped from internal directories. When he tried to reapply elsewhere, his applications were quietly rejected. He remembered walking through the MIT courtyard after receiving the final letter. The way the building suddenly felt foreign, how his presence seemed to bother people now, like he'd gone from being a rising mind to a stain they didn't want on their record. "I went to Vance's office the day they finalized it," West said quietly. "I knew he set you up. I told him as much."
What did he say?
Franklin asked. West clenched his jaw. He said, "You think anyone's gonna take his word over mine?" Franklin nodded slowly. He'd always known, but hearing it out loud, even decades later, still stung. Elijah, sitting on the armrest of the couch, listened in silence. "I should have spoken out louder back then," West admitted. "But you know what the 80s were. Even as a tenured black professor, my position was fragile. I had 2 kids. I kept my head down. I told myself I'd do more later." Franklin met his gaze. "You kept my paper. That was doing something." West's eyes misted, but not enough. Elijah stood, restless. He picked up the pages of the paper, running his fingers across the yellowed title. "You were erased," he said to Franklin. "Deliberately, by name, by design." Franklin gave a soft exhale. "I thought if I kept working, maybe it would balance out. Maybe the math would matter more than the history. But it doesn't," Elijah said. "Not until we make them see it." That night, Elijah sat at his laptop, Franklin beside him. They scanned the entire paper into a PDF. Elijah opened a blog platform, one he'd created for the campaign around Franklin's case. This time he gave the post a title that cut straight through the quiet erasure. "The Genius Stanford Tried to Bury." He wrote a short introduction. In 1984, a brilliant black physicist named Franklin J. Reed was falsely accused of plagiarism and removed from MIT's doctoral program. His groundbreaking research was buried, his name silenced, his life rerouted, but truth has a long memory, and it's time to bring it back to light. He attached the full scanned paper, diagrams, notes, everything. Then he clicked post. By morning, the internet was on fire. The paper was shared across academic Twitter, physics communities, and Facebook groups focused on black excellence in STEM. Professors from Yale, Princeton, Howard and Caltech began commenting. "This is real," and decades ahead of its time. The structure in Section 4 predates the formal adoption of similar models by 10 years. Where was Franklin Reed in the literature? Why haven't we heard this name before? Then came the backlash, not from the public, but from the institutions. A spokesperson from MIT issued a carefully worded statement. "We take all claims of past misconduct and oversight seriously. Due to privacy regulations, we cannot comment on individual academic records, but we are reviewing historical archives related to Mr. Reed's status." It was a start, but not enough. Franklin remained silent publicly, but inside something in him began to shift. Elijah received an email 2 days later from an MIT physics professor. Subject: Franklin J. Reed's paper. From Dr. Helena Davinsky. "Dear Elijah, I just read your father's original paper. It's stunning. I reviewed its core arguments with my graduate cohort this morning, and we agreed, if it had been published in 1984, it would have changed the direction of several research threads. More importantly, we discovered a troubling note. One of my colleagues, who recently digitized old MIT records, found a draft version of a paper published by Professor Malcolm Vance in 1985. The equations and language are nearly identical to your father's, with no mention of him. I'm attaching a side-by-side comparison, and a PDF was attached. And Elijah opened it. There in black and white was Franklin's work, stolen, reformatted, and published under Vance's name, just 1 year after Franklin had been expelled. And Franklin stared at the screen, then slowly closed his eyes. And they didn't just erase me, he said. They used me. And Elijah didn't speak. He knew what had to come next. That evening, a new document appears online. A side-by-side breakdown of Franklin's 1984 paper and Vance's 1985 publication. It ends with one line. One of these men won awards. The other lost everything. You decide who earned it. The storm didn't come slowly. It erupted, a digital tidal wave crashing against every corner of the academic world. Within 48 hours of Elijah posting the side-by-side comparison between Franklin's original 1984 paper and Malcolm Vance's 1985 publication, the story spread like wildfire. First, it circled inside physics communities. Then science journalism. Then mainstream media picked it up. CNN's headline read, "Buried Genius: How MIT Silenced a Black Physicist and Stole His Work." The New York Times ran a Sunday feature, "The Forgotten Mind of Franklin Reed." Hashtags trended across platforms. Franklin Reed, stolen genius, academic theft, Reed versus reclaim the chalk, memes, infographics, reaction videos, duets, explainers. The digital world wrapped itself around the narrative like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Franklin's face, once just another janitor on a quiet campus, now stared back from news banners, magazine covers, and protest posters. And it all began with a single paper. A paper no one wanted to read in. Now the world couldn't stop talking about it. At Stanford, the tension became unbearable. Within a day, students began organizing. Dozens gathered outside the administrative building, holding signs that read, "Intellect has no uniform. We are all Franklin. Give him his name back. From janitor to genius, you owe him." By the second night, the crowd had grown to hundreds. Professors, graduate students, even alumni who had once walked the same halls as Franklin decades ago, came forward to speak. Elijah stood on the steps of the lecture hall, where his father used to erase boards in silence. Now he spoke into a megaphone, as cameras rolled. You didn't just ignore him, you watched him clean up your errors, and you thanked him with silence. You published his thoughts and called them yours. But not anymore. You can't bury brilliance. Not forever. The crowd erupted. Inside the administration building, chaos reigned. University spokespeople scrambled to prepare statements. The board of trustees scheduled emergency meetings. Departments were instructed not to speak to the press. Faculty were told to exercise discretion. But it was too late. The story had outgrown Stanford. Franklin, meanwhile, was adrift in the eye of the storm. He didn't seek interviews. He didn't attend protests. He didn't retweet his name. Instead, he stood quietly in room 204 late at night, chalk in hand, staring at a blank board. For the first time, it felt foreign to him. His sanctuary, the room where he had once reclaimed his genius in silence, now echoed with the weight of public eyes, of expectations, of outrage he never asked to ignite. Dr. Harold West visited him that evening. "They're chanting your name outside," West said, folding his hands. "You've become the face of stolen black intellect. A reluctant martyr." Franklin didn't turn. "I'm not a martyr. I just wanted to finish the work. And now, everyone wants a piece of you." Franklin chuckled bitterly. "Where were they 30 years ago?" West sighed. "Some of them weren't born." At MIT, the situation was no better. After Elijah's leak, pressure mounted on the administration to launch a full investigation. Alumni groups released joint statements demanding accountability. A coalition of black academics signed an open letter titled, "Reckoning with the Erased." Meanwhile, MIT remained mostly silent, until a reporter discovered an archived email exchange from 1997 between Vance and another faculty member. In it, Vance casually referred to that Reed paper from years ago. "I folded into our symmetry model." The phrase ignited a firestorm. Students demanded Vance's awards be rescinded posthumously, his name removed from lecture halls, his publications audited for additional theft. But perhaps the most damaging revelation came not from MIT, but from an unexpected source. A freelance investigative journalist, Miranda Stokes, had been following the Reed story since the blog days of The Ghost Theorist. When she read the leaked comparison paper, something about the writing style nagged at her. It reminded her of another paper she'd come across months earlier, while profiling Professor Douglas Avery. She dug through Avery's early work, particularly a 1998 co-authored paper titled Probability Fields in Elastic String Models, published in a mid-tier physics journal. She ran the paper through plagiarism software, then manually cross-referenced it with Franklin's 1984 paper. The results were staggering. Whole segments, identical, rewritten equations, same structure, even a footnote in Avery's paper that referenced private unpublished notes from a former colleague, without a name. Stokes made the call. She emailed her editor. The subject line was simple. Avery cited Reed, without ever naming him. By morning the story broke. Stanford professor tied to decades-old intellectual theft. New evidence suggests pattern. Slate. Douglas Avery's genius borrowed brilliance from a janitor named Reed. The Guardian. Stanford issued a short, tense statement. We are aware of the new allegations concerning Professor Douglas Avery, and will be conducting a formal review of his published work. We reaffirm our commitment to academic integrity and accountability at all levels. Elijah read it out loud and laughed. That's it? Franklin didn't answer. He simply looked at the chalkboard. I never wanted him to be punished, he said. Just corrected. You were the correction, Elijah replied. But the damage to Avery's reputation had already begun. Students withdrew from his classes. Conferences canceled his speaking slots. A petition circulated demanding his immediate resignation. Avery, cornered, issued a public statement of his own. I have never knowingly cited or stolen the work of Mr. Franklin Reed. Any similarities in my early publications are coincidental or drawn from collective discussions that took place at the time. I stand by the integrity of my academic career. No one believed him. And then Miranda Stokes dropped the final bombshell. She released a follow-up report including a transcript of a recorded interview with a retired colleague of Avery's, Dr. Philip Cohen, who had worked with him in the late 90s. In the transcript, Cohen recalled a conversation where Avery had admitted, laughing, that some janitor had left him a corrected equation once. I think his name was Reed, Avery allegedly said. Brilliant guy. Ghosted me some gold on the board. Chalk whisperer. Cohen confirmed the quote. Stokes released the recording. And just like that, the world had Avery's own words spoken in arrogance, never meant to be heard, confirming the theft. Franklin sat in his apartment, surrounded by half-read letters, news clippings, and a now infamous chalkboard photo on the television screen. Elijah sat beside him. Quiet. You're everywhere now, Elijah said. Franklin looked away. That was never the goal. I know, Elijah said, but maybe this isn't just about you anymore. Franklin turned back, thoughtful. What if it's about all the others they erased? Elijah continued. What if we start naming them? What if your voice becomes the mic for every genius they silenced? Franklin didn't respond immediately. But deep in his chest, something new stirred. Not rage, not regret, but resolve. That evening, Franklin opened a letter slid under his door, stamped with the seal of the Nobel Committee. Inside, an invitation to a private nomination roundtable, handwritten at the bottom. Some legacies can't be ignored forever. The hum of the Geneva auditorium had quieted, but tension clung to the walls like static. Franklin had barely stepped off stage before an assistant approached with a sealed envelope. Inside, a formal request for him to deliver the summit's closing keynote address. The original speaker, a Swedish physicist and close ally of Professor Avery, had suddenly fallen ill and withdrawn. The organizers wanted Franklin to take his place, not just for his math, but for his story. And someone wasn't happy about that. Hours later, in a quiet hallway 2 floors above the main conference rooms, Franklin stood before a frosted glass door labeled Private Lounge, faculty only. Inside, Douglas Avery was waiting. He had requested a meeting off the record, claiming he wanted to offer congratulations. Franklin had agreed, not for the congratulations, but for the confrontation that was decades overdue. The door shut quietly behind him. Avery stood by the window, his blazer off, sleeves rolled to the elbows. His posture was calm, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly. He turned. Franklin. It was the first time in 30 years he'd said the name aloud. Franklin didn't offer a handshake. Avery didn't expect one. I suppose congratulations are in order, Avery said, voice controlled. You handled the board with elegance. Can't deny that. Franklin didn't blink. You've denied worse. Avery chuckled softly. I deserve that. Silent. Avery poured 2 glasses of water and set one on the table. Franklin didn't touch it. You didn't come to flatter me, Franklin said. No, Avery admitted. I came to settle things. Franklin raised an eyebrow. I'm being eaten alive in the media, Avery said. The citation, the quote, the early papers, it's all being torn apart. The university's distancing itself. My name's a punchline on late-night TV. I know, Franklin said. And still Avery continued. I don't hate you for it. You were brilliant back then. And I was ambitious. The system rewarded ambition. I told myself it was just borrowing. Just a spark from your work, not theft. But now? He looked away. I know better. Franklin said nothing. Avery stepped closer. I'm not here to defend what I did. I'm here to offer a way forward. Quietly. Franklin's jaw tightened. Go on. I'll issue a statement. Public. I'll say your original 1984 paper was foundational to my early thinking. I'll support any efforts to retroactively co-author those early pieces. Hell, I'll even endorse you for academic recognition fellowships. Maybe even tenure if Stanford has the guts. Franklin tilted his head. In exchange for Avery's voice dropped. For you not to mention what we both know, that I stole more than ideas. That I erased you to make room for me. Silence. I'm not proud of it, Avery added. But we both know how these institutions work. There's no justice without blood. If you push this further, they won't just bury me. They'll scapegoat you too. Call it a misunderstanding. Frame it as a feud. Make the world choose between pity for a janitor and faith in their system. Franklin stared at him. This deal makes it right. Avery said. No, Franklin replied. It makes it quiet. Avery's composure cracked. You think this world is ready to admit it systematically erased a black man's legacy and handed it to someone who looked like me? Yes, Franklin said. Because they already have. Avery shook his head. You're making this moral when it's political. Franklin stepped closer. It was never about politics. It was about memory. Mine, yours, theirs. All the students who learned the wrong name. All the ones who were told they didn't belong because the textbooks never showed someone who looked like them, solving equations. This was never about me. It was about erasure. Avery went silent. You said you're being eaten alive? Franklin continued. I lived Eden. Every day. You're just feeling it for the first time. The weight of those words crushed the air between them. Then, from the hallway, the soft click of a phone being locked. Elijah stepped in. He held up his phone, the screen black. I didn't get all of it, he said. Just the part where he admitted to stealing. Avery's face went pale. Elijah, Franklin warned gently. This wasn't supposed to be recorded. I know, Elijah said. But truth has a bad habit of dying quietly. He looked at Avery. You were never the genius. You were the gatekeeper. And you used my father's work to build a wall he wasn't allowed to climb. Avery swallowed hard. If that recording leaks. It won't, Elijah said. Unless you try to spin this again. Franklin nodded. I don't need your confession, Doug. I needed you to face it. That's enough for me. Avery stood frozen. I'd say we're done here, Franklin added. They left him there, standing in the quiet echo of his crumbling legacy. By the time they returned to their hotel, the world was already spinning faster. Somehow, whether from a leak or an internal university source, Stanford's Office of Academic Integrity released a late-night statement. In light of recent developments and emerging testimonies, the university is launching a formal investigation into allegations of academic misconduct and intellectual theft concerning Professor Douglas Avery. This review will include a re-examination of all early co-authored and solo publications and their citation histories. It was real, official, undeniable. Elijah read it twice before turning to Franklin. They're finally doing it. Franklin leaned back in the chair by the window, looking out over Geneva. They're doing it, he echoed, because now the silence cost them more than the truth. The next morning, Stanford's president releases a statement inviting Franklin to return as a guest of honor. But the fine print reveals more. They want him to help restructure their DEI image. Elijah reads it, stunned. They're not giving you power, they're asking for cover. It started with a single poster on the back of a lecture hall door. This Saturday, noon. Quad. March for Franklin. Underneath, we don't forget those who were told to disappear. No big sponsor. No major student group at first. Just a whisper. But that whisper became a ripple. And the ripple became a wave. By the end of the week, there were thousands of posters, taped to buildings, dorm windows, bulletin boards. Franklin Reed's name was now etched into the language of resistance. And on Saturday they came. Not for a game. Not for a speaker series. Not for a celebrity. They came for a man who had scrubbed their chalkboards in silence for 20 years. By noon, the Stanford quad pulsed with bodies. Students in lab coats and hoodies, professors with tenure and protest signs, alumni wearing their old Stanford sweatshirts with new slogans scrawled across them. Give the genius the mic. Franklin solved the problem. Stanford is the problem. The only theft here was intellectual. Local media trucks lined the perimeter. Drones buzzed overhead. On stage, a banner stretched above the makeshift podium. We are all Franklin. Elijah stood near the back, heart pounding, notebook in hand. He'd seen movements online before, #driven, flash-in-the-pan outrage. But this was different. This was personal. He looked to his left. His father stood in the shade of a tall redwood, arms crossed, sunglasses on. Dressed in a simple gray suit, Franklin Reed looked more like a reluctant guest than the man the world had come to hear from. But the crowd waited. And when one of the student organizers stepped to the mic and said, "Before we begin, we invited Mr. Reed to speak," a chant broke out. "Franklin! Franklin!" Franklin shook his head. "I didn't come to speak," he said to Elijah. "I came to listen." "You can't," Elijah whispered. "Not today. I was never a podium man, son." "You were never given a podium," Elijah said. "There's a difference." Franklin looked at the stage, at the crowd, at the expectant, tearful eyes of students holding signs with his face drawn in chalk lines. He turned away. "I can't," he said quietly. "I've been quiet too long. I wouldn't know where to start." Elijah reached into his bag. "I do." He pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. Franklin's handwriting. "You remember this?" he asked. "I found it in your old MIT folder. You wrote it the night they expelled you." Franklin's breath caught. Elijah walked toward the stage before his father could stop him. When Elijah took the mic, the crowd hushed. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He unfolded the paper. "My name is Elijah Reed, and I'm reading the words my father never got to share. Until now." He began. October 22nd, 1984. Cambridge, Massachusetts. "Tonight they made it official. They said I copied someone else's work. But I've never copied a thing in my life, except the shape of the stars above my childhood roof. They told me I was too good to be believed, that the equations were too elegant to come from my hands, and so they took them. And when I asked for a hearing, they gave me silence. Not because they had proof, but because they had power. But I'll say this, even if no one hears it, I solved what they couldn't. And one day they'll see my name, maybe not in lights, but in the footnotes. And maybe that'll be enough." Elijah looked up, voice cracking. "It wasn't enough, but we're here now." The crowd erupted into applause, and something shifted in Franklin. He walked toward the stage, slow, steady, like he'd been carrying that moment for decades. Elijah stepped aside. Franklin took the mic. He didn't start with "thank you." He didn't smile for the cameras. He looked out at the thousands gathered beneath the California sun, and began. "I used to walk through this quad with a mop bucket." Murmurs of recognition. "I used to clean the classrooms where students laughed, argued, and solved problems I couldn't afford to stay and listen to. Not because I didn't belong, but because I wasn't allowed to." Silent. "And every time I picked up that chalk to quietly fix what had been broken, I knew I wasn't just solving equations. I was trying to remind myself I still existed, that my mind hadn't died with my academic record." He paused, breathing deeply. "They told me to be quiet. So I did, for decades. And in doing so, I became exactly what they wanted, invisible." He looked down at Elijah. "But my son didn't inherit that silence." Applause swelled. Every name they erased, every voice they muted, every idea they claimed. "We carry those scars, not just in protest but in persistence." He looked into the cameras now. "I am not an exception. I'm a mirror. For every janitor, dishwasher, groundskeeper, and overlooked soul whose brilliance went unrecorded. This isn't about me reclaiming my name. This is about making sure no one else has to fight this hard to keep theirs." The crowd stood, not in one motion, but in waves, rising in awe, in grief, in respect. Franklin stepped back from the mic, but not before he said one last thing. "I used to think legacy was about publishing. Now I know it's about being remembered. Thank you for remembering me." The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. And in the back of the crowd, wearing a navy blazer and sunglasses, Stanford's university president stood still, tears visible behind her lenses. As the crowd chants Franklin's name, the president steps forward and whispers to her aide, "Bring me a plan to name the physics wing after him." We've waited long enough. But a student journalist overhears and starts writing, "Are they honoring Franklin or saving face?" The letter arrived on a cool morning. The sun slanted through the blinds into their modest apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing over unopened mail. Franklin pulled the envelope from Elijah's backpack as the teen walked in, the air still heavy with echoes of the protest. Franklin recognized the handwriting immediately. Elegant, cursive, institutional. He peeled open the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter on Stanford, letterhead, formally offering an honorary doctorate in physics. The text accompanying it spoke of deep regret over past oversights, unwavering admiration for academic contributions, and a hope that this gesture can begin to mend past errors. Elijah watched him read in silence, mouth slightly agape. Franklin let the letter fall to his lap. He looked up at his son, a mixture of something like exhaustion and quiet triumph in his gaze. They both knew what the honor meant, and what it didn't mean. 2 days later, Stanford's next public statement echoed across media platforms. It confirmed Franklin's honorary doctorate acceptance, and more surprisingly, a position offered faculty advisor in the Department of Physics, primarily to mentor minority and disadvantaged students. The headline blared, "Franklin Reed returns to Stanford, this time as a scholar." The university celebrated it as a symbol of progress. They quoted the president, the dean, and even Dr. Lenora Campbell, calling it a restorative step and a reclaimed legacy. Avery didn't comment publicly. His name was conspicuously absent. In their living room, Franklin sat watching the news on a muted screen. Yellowstone and antiseptic campus buildings flicked past, with smiling anchors expressing relief that the story had reached some resolution. Elijah stood nearby, phone in hand, reading notifications. Emails from alumni, from media wanting commentaries, offers to speak at other universities. The world was paying attention. Franklin finally exhaled. "I don't want a degree I didn't earn," he said quietly. His voice carried decades of restraint. Elijah looked up sharply. "But they're trying to fix it. This is your recognition." Franklin shook his head. "This is a cover, dressed as honor. A degree they think redeems them. But a paper they stole isn't undone by a medal." Elijah's mouth pressed tight. Franklin continued, tone calm but firm. "If I accept titles, then what about the generations they've buried? I've been patient. I've been silent. I've let them define my worth by silence, not by merit." Elijah's eyes glittered. "You want more," he said softly. Franklin folded his hands in his lap. "And I will take my name," he acknowledged. "But I will not accept gestures when they come wrapped in guilt." They sat together, the hum of the television a reminder of how far the story had traveled, and how much farther it needed to go. 2 days later, Elijah updated the campaign site. A new post went live. "I stand with my father, not his degree." In it, Elijah announced that Franklin would decline the honorary doctorate and refuse the advisory appointment, instead proposing that Stanford commit to fully fund 10 scholarships annually for underrepresented students in physics, establish an archive dedicated to the work of marginalized scholars whose contributions were suppressed, permanently name the physics courtyard after Franklin J. Reed. The post circulated with force. Media outlets evolved the story, from science scandal to academic revolution. The narrative now involved not only restitution but systemic change. Stanford caught off guard, responded quickly. Statements were revised. "We respect Mr. Reed's decision, and look forward to partnering with him in constructive, community-driven ways." But under the surface, panic circulated. In department offices, whispers fluttered. "Does he mean half our endowed scholarships? Is that archive a bombshell in slow motion? Who is advising this young man?" Avery, whose influence had crumbled, remained silent. 2 nights later, in the courtyard behind their apartment, Franklin and Elijah sat at a small table draped with newspaper clippings and a glowing laptop. Elijah's face glowed as he read aloud, "Scholarships for physics students. Reed Archive. Physics courtyard in his name. People are pushing for more." Franklin nodded, but his eyes were distant. "I need to make this real," he said. "Not through token honor, but through lasting structures." Elijah looked at him, awed by the humility in those words. That night, university officials visited them. Not with awards, but with delegation. Assistant Dean of Student Affairs, a development officer, and a PR executive. They came with platitudes and paperwork, offering to design the scholarship fund themselves and propose scholarship models aligned with Mr. Reed's vision. Franklin turned them down again. "I see how to build. Let me build alongside you," he told them. "Don't decide for me. Let our community decide." The visitors left quietly. The hum of Stanford's polished machinery gunned, but Franklin held firm. Meanwhile, Avery's downfall continued. A statement surfaced in which he lamented stepping back due to health concerns. Critics called it evasive. The cause was uncertain. Stress, guilt, career collapse, or something deeper. Faculty discussions mentioned a needed ethical reset in curriculum review. Some professors advocated for Franklin to chair a committee auditing syllabi for attribution errors. Avery offered no resistance. There was no public defense. Only the rustle of retreats. Elijah's phone record grew. Messages from MIT offering a visiting scholar position. Harvard offering a lecture circuit. Another from Stanford. A tenured offer, not advisory, but a real compensated position. Elijah showed his father. "Choose an offer," he urged. Franklin looked through each email. Opportunity, visibility, prestige. But his gaze settled. Calm, quiet. "I will not replace them in the halls they denied," he said. "I will make a place where no one is denied." Elijah's mouth tightened in frustration, then broke into understanding. Weeks later, Elijah stood at a small podium in their living room, recording a video for the campaign. "Thank you for standing with us. These offers, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, are gracious. But Dr. Franklin J. Reed will invest in others first. Tomorrow we stand at 10 scholarships. We stand at an archive, a courtyard, and a school's future." He turned toward his father. "Because he taught us that legacies aren't given, they're built." Elijah closed the camera and hugged Franklin, eyes bright. Days later, campus construction crews broke ground in the Stanford physics courtyard. A plaque was placed in honor of Franklin J. Reed, scholar, mentor, truth-teller. Nearby red bricks formed the foundation of what would become the Reed Institute, an independent lab and school for previously overlooked minds. Plans circulated almost instantly through academic circles. The final twist came when Dr. Lenora Campbell posted a photo of Franklin standing next to the new plaque, chalkboard in hand, surrounded by students of all backgrounds whispering equations, not recognition, but ownership. Elijah watched that photo and then looked at his father. "Want to see what others cannot yet see?" Franklin gave a small, proud smile. Elijah's offer, to start a school named after Franklin, a place to nurture invisible geniuses, for minds like his father's, for souls buried in uniform. Franklin looked away, emotions welling. "You choose," Elijah said gently. Franklin looked back, resolute. "Yes," he said. "I choose." Elijah leans in and says, "Then tonight I'm raising money for our foundation. And tomorrow, we begin building Reed Academy." But then Elijah's phone rings. It's MIT again, asking, "Could we partner with you?" Franklin and Elijah exchange looks and the question echoes. Will they build their own path or be co-opted by the very institutions they fought? The building wasn't much at first. A converted community center on the edge of East Palo Alto. Fluorescent lights, cracked linoleum floors, a roof that still leaked in one corner when it rained. But for Elijah Reed, it wasn't about where they started. It was about who they welcomed. At the front door, a painted sign read, "Reed Institute for Invisible Geniuses." Below it in smaller type, "Founded for those who were never seen, but never stopped seeing." Elijah stood outside that door the morning it opened, his father by his side, and a line of nearly 40 applicants trailing down the sidewalk. They weren't the usual students. There were no polished SAT scores or Ivy League dreams. There was a woman in her 50s with a GED, who once repaired MRI machines. A young black man who'd spent 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, now obsessed with string theory. A janitor from an Oakland high school who had written a 400-page treatise on fractals in his spare time. A homeschooled girl from Fresno who could explain quantum entanglement better than most professors. No one had ever called them prodigies. No one had ever looked. Until now. Inside, Franklin chalked equations on a wide blackboard, salvaged from a shuttered middle school. His movements were slower than in his youth, but no less precise. A group of students gathered behind him. Silent, focused. He spoke softly, letting the math breathe. "This is not about proving you're smart," he told them. It's about discovering where your mind goes when no one's watching. For the first time, his lessons were not anonymous corrections, not fragments left behind on Stanford's boards after hours. They were intentional, named. The respect was not manufactured, it was earned, and finally returned. Elijah watched from the hallway, leaning against the doorframe. He'd never seen his father smile while teaching. Now he did. The media had covered the launch, but none of them expected what came next. On the third week of classes, Elijah gave a short address to the first full gathering of Reed Institute students and faculty, a mix of second-chance educators, formerly incarcerated STEM mentors, retired professors who'd defected from academia, and autodidacts who never fit the mold. He didn't use notes. He didn't need them. He spoke from a folding chair in the center of the room. They said we weren't qualified, that we lacked credentials. But the truth is, we weren't unqualified. We were unrecognized. They told us to clean the classrooms, not lead them. Told us to sit in the audience, not speak from the stage. But talent doesn't ask for permission. It finds a way to exist, quietly, until someone dares to believe in it. Welcome to the Reed Institute. We see you now, and the world will too. The video posted by a student on TikTok went viral overnight. Tens of millions of views. Hashtags, invisible geniuses. Reed's speech. We were unrecognized. Teachers began assigning the speech in high school civics classes. Education advocates demanded funding for similar programs nationwide, and applications to the Reed Institute quadrupled in less than a month. Meanwhile, Franklin began mentoring a quiet student named Jalen, an 18-year-old ex-convict with an ankle monitor and a mind built for theoretical modeling. Jalen barely spoke, but he could calculate in symbols most people never understood. One day, while reviewing string loop variations, Jalen corrected Franklin mid-equation, not out of arrogance, but with quiet precision. Franklin didn't flinch. He turned to the board, read it again, and nodded. "You're right," he said. "That was my mistake." Jalen's mouth parted slightly in shock. No professor at his old detention center would have admitted that. "Good eye," Franklin added. "Let's run with your logic." It was the moment Jalen realized he wasn't just a student. He was seen. Every day, the institute pulsed with brilliance previously discarded. Women in their 60s laughed over lunch as they debated geometry proofs. A teenage girl with dyscalculia had just built her own logic-based calculator app. A man who'd mopped floors for 20 years now gave guest lectures on statistical anomalies in climate data. And Franklin, once erased, now walked through every room as its architect, not because of a title, but because of what he had built from silence. One evening, as Elijah prepared a presentation for potential donors, Franklin sat at a table across from him, grading papers with a red pen and a tired smile. "You know," Franklin said without looking up, "I never imagined I'd teach like this." "You mean in a school with leaky ceilings and no security badges?" Elijah teased. Franklin chuckled. "I mean with freedom, with purpose, without pretending." He looked up. "You gave me that." Elijah shook his head. "No. I just built the walls. You filled the rooms." They sat in a shared silence, the kind that comes not from lack of words, but from the weight of enoughness. A week later, a letter arrived. Thick envelope. Gold trim. Sealed with a crest Elijah didn't recognize. He handed it to his father without a word. Franklin opened it, scanning slowly. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "The Nobel Committee for Physics would be honored by your presence as our guest at this year's laureates' dinner in Stockholm. In light of recent revelations and your lifelong contributions to theoretical physics, we are extending an invitation to nominate your work for retrospective consideration." Elijah blinked. "They're going to consider you." Franklin said nothing, but a quiet tremble passed through his fingers. Not from pride, but from the realization that truth, even after being buried, had survived. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Elijah looked at him. "Will you go?" Franklin stared at the ceiling. "I used to dream of the Nobel when I was 26, he said softly. "Now I dream of Jalen solving what I couldn't." He looked at his son. "I'll go, but not to be crowned." Elijah waited. "I'll go to remind them who they missed." As the news of the Nobel invitation spreads, a senator proposes a national initiative to fund programs like the Reed Institute across the country. But the bill includes a clause that would place government control over curriculum, threatening the independence that made Reed's model work. Elijah reads the fine print and frowns. "They want our name, but not our vision." The grand hall of Oslo City Hall was hushed as Franklin Reed ascended the stage, his gray suit impeccable, his posture firm but humble. The Norwegian flags draped around the room seemed to bow with him, as if they bore witness to a truth long denied finally spoken aloud. The international press stood at the ready, pens poised, cameras clicking, expecting spectacle. What they didn't expect was the quiet power of a man once mocked for cleaning floors walking into one of the most prestigious ceremonies on earth. Flashes from cameras flickered across Franklin's face as he paused, nodded to the chair of the Nobel Committee, and accepted the weighty medal. The applause was thunderous, but it echoed beyond that hall. It reverberated through university corridors, cleaned classrooms, and anonymous chalkboards that Franklin had touched in the darkness. Elijah watched from the front row, eyes rimmed with tears. Behind him, rows of laureates, diplomats, and dignitaries applauded the man who had been invisible for decades, but now stood unmistakably at the center of historical reckoning. When the microphones cleared, and silence settled like quiet snow, Franklin lifted the Nobel diploma, its golden seal catching the light, and began to speak. He started with the world he had lost. Flashback to a chalkboard in room 204, late night at Stanford, chalk particles drifting like dust, in a beam of silence. Franklin's hands moved through equations, correcting what others had claimed solved. He didn't speak. He only erased and refined. Behind him, footsteps. Professor Avery, a mocking tone that stung more than shame. You clean boards, not solve them. Franklin didn't speak then. He only wiped the board. The memory returned now, vivid, painful, necessary. Back in Oslo, Franklin spoke softly but with authority. When I first wrote equations on that board, I did so in silence, hoping no one would see me fall. But the chalk kept singing, even when the world looked away. He paused. The room leaned in. They mocked me for my uniform, for my role. But clothes don't define contribution. It was never about the dirt on my hands, but the clarity in my mind. The crowd listened. Some bowed their heads. Others stared, suddenly aware of the gravity and the simplicity of the words. Flashback to a small dorm room. Young Franklin hunched under a lamp, typing his thesis in dread and determination. A paper proposing radical new connections between quantum loops and mass theory. The silence of rejection letters piling up, the sudden charge of plagiarism, the shock, the humiliation, the excruciating choice to drop out, the walk back home, head bowed, hope nearly broken. In Oslo, Franklin's gaze tightened. They said my ideas were too elegant to come from me. They took my paper. They took my name. They took my future. But they couldn't take my mind. He swallowed. The room was still. I may stand here now in the golden glow of recognition. But I do not stand alone. I carry every mind whose brilliance was whispered in janitor closets, erased in the archives, buried in the footnotes. Flashback to a community center, the first day of the Reed Institute. Students lining up outside, faces lit with hope. Franklin at the blackboard, finally teaching names, not just numbers. Jalen correcting him mid-equation. Students applauding that correction, as though it were a victory, because it was. Back to Oslo. Franklin let an unexpected crack of emotion show. You might expect victory to taste sweet, but victory without justice is hollow. I stand here because justice finally chased me down. He raised a hand, offering the medal to Elijah, who stood as if rooted, his eyes shining. Flashback to that protest at Stanford Quad, the audience chanting Franklin's name. His hesitant speech, we weren't unqualified, we were unrecognized. The tear in the university president's eye. The march, the crowd of thousands who believed in memory over manipulation. Now Franklin stood firm. I am not just a laureate tonight. I carry the voices of thousands who demanded that history be corrected. The applause resumed, longer, richer. He closed with a dedication. To the janitors who saw what was hidden. To the silent minds dreaming in middling labs and second shift rooms. This medal is yours. We were never just cleaning rooms. We were shaping ideas. And now, the world sees. As he returned the medal to the podium, and the orchestra began softly playing, Franklin stepped back, shoulders squared, dignity reclaimed, walking into a new chapter that belonged to untold stories everywhere. Elijah stepped forward from the audience and met his gaze. They shared a moment, fierce, unspoken, powerful. As Franklin steps off stage, cameras capturing his every breath, The Nobel Committee chair leans toward a press aide and whispers, "He changed the narrative tonight." But the aide's response chills them both. Not only that, tonight, the archives are opening. Room 204 looked exactly the same. Same windows, same dust lines in the corners of the floor, same creaky third tile near the lectern. But the chalkboard, the one Franklin Reed once cleaned night after night in silence, no longer bore mathematical equations left behind by others. It now bore his name, the Franklin J. Reed Memorial Lecture Hall, dedicated to truth unseen and genius unheard. A small bronze plaque hung just beneath the blackboard, etched with the line from his Nobel speech. "We were never unqualified. We were unrecognized." It had been only 3 weeks since Oslo. 3 weeks since the world watched a former janitor rewrite history with words, as measured as his math. And now room 204 was quiet again. But not from erasure, from reverence. Franklin Reed had passed away peacefully, in his sleep the night before the Reed Institute's second semester was set to begin. His notebooks were still open on the desk. His coffee cup half full sat next to a red pen he had used to grade a student's essay on symmetry theory. Elijah had found him. There were no signs of struggle, no pain, just stillness. A man who had spent his life waiting to be heard had finally spoken, and then gracefully gone silent. The world reacted with a grief that felt like delayed recognition. Headlines ran across every major outlet. Franklin Reed, the janitor who reshaped physics, dies at sea. From mops to medals, a life of stolen time reclaimed. The mind we nearly missed. His funeral was held at Stanford Chapel, packed beyond capacity. Students sat on the grass outside with speakers rigged up, listening to stories told by his students, his colleagues, and most moving of all, by Elijah. Elijah stood before the crowd, his voice clear but raw. "My father never chased greatness. He just chased justice, and along the way, he found both. He died not with regrets, but with reach, and that I think is what brilliance looks like." Weeks passed, and something curious began to happen across universities in the US and Europe. Professors started including the Reed equation in their curriculum, a once dismissed loop transformation model, now taught alongside Einstein and Dirac. The equation Franklin had scribbled in chalk, first in a darkened Stanford classroom, then later on the Nobel stage, had become standard reading in graduate-level courses, not because it was fashionable, because it was right. At MIT, a student group successfully petitioned for a day to be named Invisible Genius Recognition Day. At Harvard, a black student-run journal published a 300-page commemorative issue on Franklin's life, with essays titled "Erased but Brilliant," and he gave us the language of being seen. But at Stanford, the most meaningful tribute was far quieter. Room 204 became sacred. Elijah now taught there, not because it was symbolic, though it was, but because he wanted to be grounded in the same space where the silence had once felt so loud. Every Tuesday and Thursday he lectured in front of the same chalkboard his father had once erased, now filled with equations that bore his name. Sometimes he'd glance at the door, and for a split second he'd swear he saw Franklin standing there, hands in his pockets, expression soft, head slightly tilted like he was evaluating his son's logic. And maybe, in a way, he was. On those days Elijah didn't cry. He smiled. One evening, long after his students had left, Elijah stayed behind to tidy up. He erased the board, wiped the desks, and closed a few left-behind notebooks. Then he heard it, the soft scrape of chalk. He turned. A figure stood at the board, short, heavy-set, in a dark blue uniform. One of the janitors. A younger man, early 30s maybe. Latino. He didn't know anyone was watching. He had written part of an equation. Complex. Not perfect, but close. Elijah didn't speak. He watched as the man erased it quickly, nervous. "Sorry," the janitor said. Turning, Elijah stepped forward. "What were you working on?" The janitor hesitated. "Just something I saw online. I was trying to remember it." Elijah walked to the board, studied the marks. "You were recreating a Reed variation," he said. The janitor's eyes widened. "I thought it looked familiar." Elijah picked up a piece of chalk. "Want to finish it together?" The janitor's voice cracked. "You serious?" Elijah nodded. "My dad always said genius doesn't ask for permission." They stood at the board for an hour, a professor and a janitor, equals in thought. The chalk didn't care what uniforms they wore. Later that night, Elijah sat alone in the empty classroom. The moonlight slanted across the blackboard. He looked around and let himself feel it. The silence. The legacy. The loss. The triumph. And he whispered into the stillness, "You were never just a janitor. You were always a teacher." Across the world, the Reed Academy expanded. New branches opened in Detroit, Atlanta, Oakland. The mission was simple: train those whom the system forgot, but who never forgot how to think. The invisible were now unavoidable. In room, it stayed exactly the same, just the way Franklin left it. As the lights dim in room 204, a new janitor enters quietly with a bucket and mop. He sees a complicated set of symbols still faint on the board. He stares at them for a long moment, then smiles to himself, and begins to solve them. How many geniuses have we ignored? Just because of their uniform. Fade to black. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think twice about who we overlook and why, don't let it end here. Type yes if you believe every genius